Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I wanted to talk about a recent trip I took to Ukraine. I wrote a piece about it. It's actually going to be the first in several pieces I think I'm going to do for Lincoln Square. Um, just to sort of set the table, I had the opportunity to join a group uh, that organizes convoys of vehicles, a lot of ambulances, pickup trucks, panel trucks, some regular cars, fills them with non-lethal aid, which means a lot of different things, but big focus on medical supplies um, and other basic needs that the front lines have. Um, and it's a Finnish and American group. The group has been targeted by the Russians, so they prefer to keep their name out of the press and be somewhat vague about the details. But it's a group that came together sort of organically, a Finnish American group, Finnish and American group. Um, they acquire these vehicles, they either buy them, get them donated, um, pick them up and refurbish them. And some come down from Helsinki and some come from Europe. And in our group, we met in Warsaw and then drove into Kyiv. Uh, the supplies and the aids then distributed and leave the vehicles uh, with those who are going to use them on the front lines. And we took the train back to Poland. So I was only in Kyiv, well, driving in, but only overnight in Kyiv and one night in Lviv. Um, so let's start with that. You know, Anne Applebaum, as she typically did a brilliant gave a brilliant speech from Kyiv not too long ago, talking about the city. Um, the the idea that Kyiv is somewhere on the brink in a war-torn capital, it just doesn't feel that way at all. It feels like a very normal European city for the most part until the air raid sirens go off. But there's millions of people there. They're going about their lives regularly. A lot of dark humor, but uh, in no way has the city ground to a halt in any way. Um, Everybody has an air raid app that download on their phones, uh, and it goes off. I forgot to take it off my phone, and I got back to my house in Vermont, and all of a sudden the air raid siren went off. And I just stopped to think about it. Here I'm in Vermont, this kind of bucolic setting, and in Kyiv, they're going to shelters because the drones are coming. Um, and you know what? It's just there's so much remarkable, extraordinary about what's happening in Kyiv and Ukraine. And part of it is that to the people there, I don't think it seems extraordinary or unordinary. They really don't see that they have any choice, and they don't, except the bleak future of living under Russian domination. And it's clear what that is like now. It's genocide, torture, destruction of Ukraine culture, destruction of Ukraine. So one of the opportunities I had was through Ken Harbaugh, who, if you don't follow Ken Harbaugh's Substack, you should. He's done stuff here on Lincoln Square, former Navy pilot. He's part of a group that I was involved with since the beginning on their board, Veterans for Responsible Leadership, which is another group you should look up and support. But Ken has been going on these convoys several times in the past, and it was through Ken that I had this opportunity to go on this convoy. And Ken invited me to go with him to visit someone who's become a friend of his, who is a Supreme Court justice in Ukraine, who, along with some other judges and lawyers, colleagues, fairly early in the war, they voluntarily set up anti-drone defense positions on the Dnipro River, which runs through Kyiv. And without kind of going into too much detail, their position that we visited was on top of an old houseboat. It reminded me of the kind of houseboat that like fraternities would use, the kind of clapped out houseboat. And on the roof, they have machine guns mounted. And it just, think about it. It's mind boggling to me. I grew up, my dad was a lawyer, everybody in my family were lawyers and judges. And, I spent a lot of time as a kid going to these law offices, courts. And here they go to work, they hear cases, decide cases, normal functioning of law, then take off their robe, put on some body armor, and stand on top of a houseboat in the middle of the night shooting down drones. I mean, that's their life. I was fascinated, and I write about this in this piece, that one of the 3 machine gun placements that they had was 4 Maxim guns chained together in this completely homemade arrangement. Now, Maxim guns are the machine gun. It is a machine gun that it and its immediate sort of variations were the weapons of destruction in World War I. The first weapons that would fire 600 rounds a minute. And when you hear about like the Battle of the Somme, where there were 57,000 casualties, wrap your mind around that, 57,000 casualties, British casualties, the first day, it was because of Maxim guns. They'd have these human waves that went over the top, and the Germans would just sit there from fixed fortified positions and just 600 rounds a minute, a harvest of death. So they have 4 of these, which they got from old Soviet stock, mounted on a swivel with updated optics. So they're actually looking in a screen, and they have welded a bar to the triggers of these 4 guns. So by pressing on the bar, you're operating 4 Maxim guns at once, which, 4 times 600 rounds a minute. And they have a Browning 50 caliber machine gun and a Soviet equivalent as well. So they have these mounted on the river because a lot of times these drones come down the river and go into Kyiv. And this is their first line of defense. And they pay for everything themselves except for the hard cost of the ammunition. And there's several of these they have in position along the river. And just to get a sense of how sort of personal this is, the Supreme Court justice, his house, a drone had blown up across the narrow street from his house a couple of weeks before. Doesn't know if it was targeted at him or if it was just the fact that they are attacking these neighborhoods and his number came up. But we visited his house, this kind of charming suburban brick house. And the drone had hit across the street, big crater, and it blew out all the windows in their house. And, he and his wife had spent the summer, like people do, replacing the windows in their house. It's kind of an ongoing renovation project. All of those were blown out. They had been saving to buy a new car, had just gotten it. It was in the driveway. It was just blown to shit. They were sleeping in the cellar of their house, so they survived. It came at 6 a.m, which increasingly is something that the Russians are doing, trying to get people coming to work at sort of an early rush hour, but when it's still a little bit dark, which makes it harder to shoot them down. His yard is littered with carbon and plastic and some metal from the drone. And they're just going about cleaning it up like you would do like a fall cleaning of your yard to rake out leaves. Very matter of fact. Sticking out of the window of his once fancy new car was a shattered wing of a drone with the number still on it. And this is just a reality. of their lives. And, I was there in October, and it was getting chilly, but nothing like what it's going to be like in this winter. And I was just thinking, I was cold and I was wearing a heavy jacket, and that wind just tears down the river. To be out there all night in a dark January night, a long night, and it's not just that you're shooting down the drones, the drones are coming for you as well. And this is 100-kilogram on average warhead on one of these drones to fly 100 miles per hour. I mean, that's about as real and as frightening as it gets. And they just do it every day, and they've been doing it for a couple of years now, more than a couple of years, almost 3 years now. I think it was just a sort of insight into what it's like. Now, we didn't go out to the front lines, but Ken Harbaugh did go out to the front lines, and he wrote a piece for The Atlantic about a month ago. Excuse me, that if you haven't read, you really should. And it's a story of Ken tells of going out to the front lines and embedding with a drone unit. And Ken was supposed to be there overnight, but the Russians identified where their position was and kept attacking them, and was stuck there for almost 2 days, because the really dangerous part of this is when you leave your bunker to get to your vehicle and then to get out. And, they're flying these FPV drones, they call them, first-person view drones. So I don't know if this is really understood what they're like. These are drones that are connected, hardwired by a cable to a handheld screen. And these drones have up to 10 kilometers of cable in them. So that means that somewhere in a 10-kilometer radius, a Russian is sitting there. He's looking through what he's seeing, and it's just cruising around looking for targets. And when you hear about the human safaris, which is a chilling name of a documentary that was made about Kherson, this is what these, goddamn Russians are doing. There was a recent horrible case where there was a much-loved figure who, in her 80s, grandmother, who kept goats. And she had kept her goats all through the war. And some Russian monster tracked her down and blew her and her goats up. Like, why? What military values are blowing up an 80-something-year-old grandmother with goats? But that's just what this is. This is a war of genocide by every definition of what genocide is. And Ken recounts what it's like to be in that bunker, and the Russians have spotted them, and they're attacking them repeatedly. And, the ceiling is shaking, and these guys are in there with dark humor and dealing with it and fighting back. And while we were in Kyiv, Ken left and went out to the front lines and delivered another piece, which he's shown here on Lincoln Square. There was a report from the front. And, I visited with a couple of old journalist friends of mine who have been in Kyiv before the war broke out. And when they heard about what Ken was doing, they were like, we don't do this. That is too risky. I don't, like one said, no, I don't, that's insane. I don't go there. But it's so important that we actually see what it is. And I just can't admire and praise Ken enough for the courage it takes to go out and tell these stories. He did another one from Crimea, when an all-night attack in Crimea. He was with an anti-drone unit, anti-missile unit in Crimea. One of the missions of this A group that I was with, they support an engineering company in Kyiv that is developing land-based drones. And the drones they're developing are not drones that are carrying warheads, which a lot of these drones, there's that whole variation of drones. They were transport drones. drones. It's what they were focused on, to take in supplies and take wounded out. And because now with these drones, and 80% of the casualties in the Ukrainian war now are through drones, 80%. And you can imagine you get wounded. How do you get out? And one of the reasons they're in such need of ambulances because the survival rate of an ambulance is a matter of weeks. And they wait. They know that ambulance is going to have to come, and they blow it up coming or going. Oftentimes they wait until the ambulance is full, and they'll try to blow it up, and with a horrible rate of success, so that they get not just the ambulance drivers and the medical crew, but the wounded soldiers. And these land-based drones, are extraordinary. We saw one that they're developing that has a range of 100 kilometers. That is sort of about the size of like the flatbed of a Camry, 4-wheel drive, of course, with big knobby tires, and it can bring wounded out. And there is a high survival rate among Ukrainian military because they care about their soldiers and they pay attention. And there's tremendous training and stress on immediate first aid. And one of the things that the group I was with was we delivered first aid kits that we replaced the tourniquets that came with them with state-of-the-art modern tourniquets, because that's been a big issue apparently. Those tourniquets are a good bit more expensive than the tourniquets that you just buy in these kits. But the tourniquets you buy in these kits are not very effective. And a lot of people have died or lost limbs because of them. So we went through, and this process is just taking out the old tourniquets and putting in new tourniquets and closing up the kits, and we gave them out to soldiers. But there is a high rate of soldiers losing limbs in Ukraine. And part of that is because how long it's taking to evacuate them and get them to hospitals. And when you hang out in Ukraine, you start to notice, you see a lot more people with amputated legs and arms than you would if you were just walking around St. Louis or New York City. So that's just sort of a little insight what it's like there. I think our future is being determined in Ukraine. If Russians are able to launch the largest ground war against a democracy in Western Europe since World War II, and if they were able to crush Ukraine, it would be the end of the world as we know it. For all this America First stuff, the reason one of the major reasons America is the wealthiest country in the world now, is because of the post-war Pax Americana that has allowed Europe to flourish. And it's not a zero-sum game like this felon from Queens in the White House seems to think. When Europe does well, America does well. They're a solid trading partner. It's a transference of wealth both ways. It creates wealth. And if they were able to take Ukraine, you can hold your breath till they want to go into Poland. And this idea that we take for granted now that you can fly to Paris, get in the car, and drive to Warsaw, that won't be possible. The whole world will be different. And I don't think the Biden administration did nearly enough. I think that there are repeated moments where, had we given Ukrainians, we, the collective West, but really that's led by the US, what they needed, they could have ended this war. I am in the camp of worrying about Soviet nuclear response. It's what Russian nuclear response, what the Russians want. They're not going to do it. Putin does not want to commit suicide, which this would be. And we have sort of dragged this out, and Biden administration didn't do enough, but there was never a question with the Biden administration, which side they were on. And there is now. And I have to say, I worked in the Republican Party for a long time. I was drawn to the party that was Ronald Reagan standing in front of the Berlin Wall saying, "Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev." And somehow, in a change that is unlike any we have ever seen in the history of American politics, for decades, the beating heart of the most consistent opposition to the Soviet Union and an expansive Russian Federation was the most conservative element of the Republican Party. That has now become the beating heart of the pro-Putin movement in American politics. And it's absolutely shameful. And we know that, why is this? Well, we know Russians helped elect Donald Trump. We somehow quit talking about that. And I can't imagine that they ever could even have any glimmer of what they would get. They didn't only get an American president, they got a party. Because the Republican Party now will not stand up to Donald Trump. And I know a lot of these senators. I helped elect a lot of them. They are 100% behind Ukraine. But they won't call Donald Trump out by name, and they won't do what it takes. You take someone like Roger Wicker, chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Roger's from Mississippi. I worked for Roger. I've known Roger forever. Most of his career a lot of it was focused on building U.S. alliances like NATO, a stronger U.S. as deterrent. He's now chairman of the Armed Services Committee, some position he's wanted since he was a young congressman. Before that, when he was an aide in Washington, and we were both pages in Washington. And what does he do? His first act is to usher in Pete Hegseth. Why? And I say this without equivocation. I don't think you can call yourself a patriot and support Pete Hegseth to run the U.S. military. I mean, this is somebody literally wouldn't let cut their lawns. I mean, what, you want this kind of drunk with tattoos whose own mom knows he has problems with women around the house? No. But now he's in charge of the U.S. military. It's absolutely shameful. And one of the great, great untold stories of this time is how the Republican Party has been compromised by Russians. And it's been going on multiple levels. We saw it with the NRA, which some of that scandal came out. A lot of it never really came out, the amount of money that the NRA was getting from Russians and then feeding. We've seen it with the social media, so-called conservative, so-called influencers who were getting paid through a proxy by Russia. And you can stand there like Lindsey Graham and say, I support Ukraine. I go to Ukraine. I have these photo ops. But if you don't call Donald Trump out, you're complicit. You are a Russian stooge. And it doesn't matter that Russia doesn't have anything on you like they may have on Donald Trump. You're in the same position. If you're a member of Tony Soprano's gang, you support Tony Soprano, you are a gang member. And that's what these Republicans so sadly have become. I mean, we live in a world in which Bernie Sanders is to the right of the Republican Party on foreign policy. Think about that. I mean, Bernie went on a honeymoon in Russia, but he didn't fall in love with Russia the way Republicans have. And I'll talk more. I'm going to write more about what I saw and experienced in Ukraine. But I just think that, everybody has a lot going on in their lives. We all do. We have very busy lives. It's difficult to imagine a land war in Europe. And there are Americans dying over there. A good number of them have volunteered and given all. But there's not enough that it becomes an American cause. There's not enough hometown newspapers that are reporting about the death of an American there, as if it would be like it was in the Vietnam War, or if we were at war in Ukraine. But there is so much that we in the West, and that includes Europe, which has an economy 12 times the size of Russia, and somehow they're being intimidated by Russia. How is this? This is insane. We need to do more for Ukraine on every level. And I think about this a lot because, I'm of a generation where, my father, uncle, relatives fought in World War II. And I think about all the Americans who are buried in Europe now. If they came back to life and you ask them, do you want to fight on the side of a Russian dictator or you want to fight for a European democracy? What do we think they would choose? Why are they buried in Europe? They're buried in Europe because they went there to fight for European democracies against a dictatorial madman, which is what we have with Putin again. So this is good versus evil. This is not complicated. And we have this strand now of Elon Musk, David Sachs, Peter Thiel, J.D. Vance, that are all Russian stooges of various degrees and various degrees of effectiveness. I mean, I've said before, if Republicans take over Congress, one of the first things they should do is they should vote to nationalize Starlink and SpaceX. Because we know that Elon Musk personally had Starlinks turned off at a critical moment in the war that could have made the difference on ending the war. Musk doesn't dispute that. He says I don't know, it's insane. The idea that some guy who, according to the Wall Street Journal, is jacked up on drugs most of the time, is deciding these sort of decisions of critical world security. It's madness. So I think when you look at Ukraine, I think they will win because they have to win. Where Kyiv is calm now for the most part, except when these drones come. But I took some time to walk through, and this book's now written about the siege of Kyiv in the first weeks, to walk through where this was fought. And it's extraordinary. I mean, at this sushi restaurant, there was a battle. At this hipster coffee house, they stood and fought the Russians. And you can walk from Kyiv to Bucha, which was the site of all these atrocities. I mean, extraordinary. We said never again in Europe, and yet it happened right there. So I would encourage everybody to talk about Ukraine, to contact your representatives in Washington to urge support. It should be the conservative position. Without doubt, it shouldn't be a partisan position at all. And I think if you got Donald Trump, you had another Republican president, I think they would act differently, but that's not the world we live in. And if you can give to Ukrainian charities, Ukraine 24 is a very good charity to donate to. But I think just not letting Ukraine fall into background noise is a moral imperative of us. And, Timothy Snyder said this when scoffing at the talk about fatigue in the West about Ukraine. And as he brilliantly put it, we don't have the right to be fatigued. You don't have the right to watch someone in the last miles of a marathon and feel tired. They're the ones who are tired. They're the ones who are going through this. And yet they get up every morning and they fight this war. And it's heroic. But if you imagine what it would be like 1944 in London, and the US had not joined the war, and the Blitz was still going on, well, that's what it's like now in Ukraine. It's the third year of this war, and they've been fighting on their own. We'll study this as a turning point in history, and there is no destiny, but Ukraine must win. Thanks, and we'll talk more soon.